Welcome back to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. Today, we're tackling a fascinating question about a core concept in modern martial arts, ground grappling. We're asking, where is the ground grappling in antique karate kata? Stick around as we break down why a weapon, a knife, and a life or death situation make ground fighting a very, very bad idea. Okay, so Nathan, where is the ground grappling in kata?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the extended long answer. Nowhere. It's not in the kata. Clearly, it's not in the kata. But karateka wearing karate gi uniforms and wearing black belts, if they are in fact dan grades or black belts. There are people are now doing it. They take people to the ground and they're doing arm. It's been happening a long time. I think people like Mario Higona, that sensei of the Gojuri karate, was doing it. I don't know, in the 70s and 80s. They take a person to the ground and maybe foot sweep them and then put an arm bar on. They can do that. They can do anything they like, but that's not in the kata. Some people have tried to suggest that where in Kasanku there's a movement where the practitioner sort of almost kneels on the ground and is very low to the ground, that's somehow ground grappling. But that's examples of anything like that are few and far between in the kata, and they don't exist at all in the Naha kata, the Sanchin, the Seisan, and the Sanseru, which we cover in another cast, which were the core kata for Naha karate and still extant in the Weichi-Ryu. We will also be covering the fact that those kata were, did cross over into the Miyagi Chojin sensei's Gojuri karate, and we will find later that those kata all had the core kata for Gojuru and the core kata for Weichi-Ryu came from the same dojo. None of those kata, the three I've mentioned, or pretty much any of the others, have any kind of ground grappling. No. Even the Naihanshin, which we've understood for coming up to 30 years, but we've understood is grappling, but it's not ground grappling. There is no jiu-jitsu, no Brazilian type jiu-jitsu, no judo type grappling, nothing on the ground in the traditional kata. And that tells you something, or should do, if you're listening. Over to you, Tom.
There's a good place to start with this is the premise that we've understood about the antique forms is that they're to do with weapons. And so the last place you'd ever want to be either trying to use a weapon or on the receiving end of a weapon is on the ground. So it's just sort of, it's foolish to think that you could be effective on the ground while using a pair of sai. And we've started to introduce the research on the Weichi, Sanchin, Seisan, and Sanseiryu, the three forms that the essence of the Nahate type karate, and they're for using a pair of sai. And there's nothing, you would never be able to use them on the ground, and you couldn't be effective with them on the ground. And so it's just not in there. It's that simple. And it's a completely different mindset from what you see today. And in modern martial arts, there's this consideration that to be a complete martial artist, you have to be efficient on the ground. And it's just not true. It just wasn't true then. That kind of thinking didn't exist. The idea of a complete martial artist is a kind of modern idea where you are good in all the ranges, punching, kicking, throwing, and ground fighting, and all the rest of it. The antique forms didn't emerge out of that type of thinking. They emerged out of the function of the forms, which is to use a pair of sai to trap, pin, press, strike someone else armed with a weapon. They would be drawn to deal with another weapon. So the most common weapon you're going to come across is probably a knife. And so the pair of sai, drawn, ready to use by one or two officers working together against a knife. The last place you're going to go if someone's got a knife is on the ground because you're dead. And considering a weapon, considering a knife, eliminates most modern ground fighting. I don't care who you are on the ground. You give someone a knife and you're mincemeat, you're done. And so it's not there because it wasn't necessary. It wasn't needed. If you ended up on the ground, hopefully your colleague will be there to the rescue. Otherwise, you're stuck. And that kind of highlights that the kata don't really contain all the answers to everything, and nor should they. They're giving you a map of the territory, fundamental core skills that then you take out and hopefully gather enough experience to be able to use them effectively, and fighting on the ground just wasn't a consideration.
Yeah. I think the grappling and ground fighting took over in a serious way with the advent of the, everyone knows this, with the mixed martial arts, where we saw the punches and the kickers swiftly getting taken to the ground and locked up. And I think, some martial artists, just in my view, were intimidated by that. It was, and it was considered to be brutally effective. I mean, there are all sorts of theories and conspiracies and ideas about that it was rigged, and that the early I don't want to go there. I don't know, can't prove it. But ever since that, whether it was or wasn't isn't the issue. It's still now, there's still all this groundwork, this grappling on the floor, and grappling has become synonymous with fighting on the floor. And if we look at my Hanshin, which is completely grappling, none of it is on the floor, and that is the primary Shorin Ryu or Shurite kata. And yes, it's grappling, but the operative remains upright. Throughout the entire kata. Yes, the person who's being grappled, that person is on the floor, but the operative is not on the floor, and that is that illustrates the whole the essence of the Shorin Ryu approach. The operative, the person in control, is in control and is upright, is not on the floor. But the person who is being subdued is on the floor, and when they get up from the floor, they are kept locked, and that is the basis of the whole approach to Shorin Ryu karate. So this taking someone to the floor and going to the floor yourself is quite frankly, it's a nonsense as far as karate kata are concerned.
I think you highlighted a point there where we're talking about just things that are worlds apart, in that a grappling match is an agreement. It's taking place under controlled conditions and it has rules. It's under an agreement that no one's going to run in and punt whoever they can. The referee isn't going to jump on top of anyone or throw some glass in. And that's
excuse me. I've been to your local. I've been to your local pub.
Yeah, but it's easy to be drawn in by the immense athleticism of the top grapplers. I mean, the competitions are amazing, and the athletes are amazing, and it's the same with the UFC. The athletes are absolutely incredible, but it's a world apart from the psychology and the thinking of the antique forms, which is nothing to do with any kind of agreement, match fight, duel, or something that's going to go on for a long period of time. When you're dealing with someone with weapons, the longer you're engaged with that person, the greater the risk just goes through the roof exponentially. If you're trying to stop someone with a knife, the longer it takes you, you're going to really if you're not already cut, the likelihood is you might be, and it could potentially be fatal. And so there's a massive risk involved in the use of the sai. And the other antique forms, we're talking about life or death risk, really. And I don't want to sound dramatic or like, this is something better or special. It's just, I'm highlighting that it's completely different. So once you draw the sai, the idea is to use them as quickly as you can to disarm, to engage and disarm the person so that they're no longer a threat. And the idea of that being any kind of reciprocal backwards and forwards, he's going to slash and I'm going to dodge, I'm going to parry. It's all crap. It's nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's go first and overwhelm as quickly as you can and get the job done. And so there's a very different psychology that emerges in those ways of, and those different types of practice and martial skills. And that's what we're talking about with the antique forms. We're not talking about, backwards and forwards. And so when you see kata applied in a way that it kind of looks like a duel, or there's going to be somebody throws a punch and there's a block and there's a second punch comes in, or there's kind of anything that starts to have 1, 2, 3, 4, you're locked into that modern martial artist approach of, there's going to be these interactions like you see in an MMA fight. I'm not saying they're easy or simple, because they're not, but that's not what we've found and understood to be true of the antique forms. And this huge emphasis on going first, being proactive, preemptive if possible, and proactive all the way through, overwhelmingly proactive, to deal with that rapidly escalating risk and so on. It's very, very different.
And so something else you mentioned just there, that when you said it's not a duel as well, and that understanding that it's not 1-to-1, it's many to 1 or 2-to-1. It is a civil arrest, and it's the officers don't go around on their own.
No, and it's the same with the palace guards, and you'd be working in a team. So we mentioned this before, reversing the modern approach. So kata bunkai being dealing with multiple opponents, you fight off one, then you fight off the next one. For the antique forms, you reverse that. It's you and a few other people taking on one. Because one person with a blade is so deadly, they don't need any training. They're going to be deadly. You've got a sharp knife. It's very, very serious. And so there's a consideration in those antique forms, from my understanding, particularly of the Seisan and the Sanseiryu, which demonstrates working in unison with others. And none of this, and to kind of stay on topic, none of this has anything to do with grappling. And there's no concept of wrestling in these forms, because you're not in any kind of a match. You're not hustling in a way that you would be fighting for a grip or positional dominance in a grappling match. It's not part of it at all. It's a world of one.
The other person is not going to be trying to do to you what you're trying to do to him, because
absolutely,
it's not two trained athletes or sportsmen at all. It's
no
policing, and no assumption can be made. Oh, look, the bad guy. It's not like a kung fu movie where the attackers all conveniently know kung fu and the hero knows kung fu, and they duke it out, they slug it out, until the good guy wins and the bad guy is defeated. And conveniently the bad guys always know all of the kung fu, and so you get this tic tac pitter patter, exchange of techniques, which couldn't be further from the truth. It doesn't mean that the arresting officers didn't ever come across somebody who had skills, but there's the assumption or this idea that it could be connected with the battlefield, where obviously the other person is equally armed as you. No, I think one of the last weapons that anyone with any common sense would want to take onto a battlefield is a pair of sai. It's got no cutting edge. What can you do? You could poke somebody with it, and if they're wearing armor, you're going to have a bad day. You're going to find that as their razor sharp sword swings down and cuts your arm off, you're going to realize you've gone to war with the wrong gear. It's not a battlefield a piece of a tool at all. But the idea that there's a reciprocal fight and that the other person might have some moves is quite frankly wrong. It's wrong. And you've raised a very important point about the duel, because that's the context in which many martial arts are seen. And as I said, a lot of that comes from films. There's always no one's ever going to forget the first time I saw, for instance, one sees Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. No one's ever going to forget that. And it's based on a series of duels. The whole film is people, and it's just assumed that that's how martial arts unfold. That's what you're doing. Once you understand the context of policing, then it's the police officer these days wherever doesn't necessarily expect. He might get someone who's done a bit of karate, but you're not going to get the sort of incredible sequences of martial arts occurring between someone who's being arrested and police officers. And as we've touched on before, anyone that's seen arrests, the van opens up, out pile a number of officers, and take down whatever the target is, and it doesn't matter what fancy moves the bad guy has. He's gonna get detained and go to jail. So the context of a tournament approach, of a sporting approach, and of an agreed combat, a duel. That's the term we've used, because it's really like pistols at dawn or rapiers or something. A couple of gentlemen having an argument over gambling or I don't know, whatever, and agreeing to fight, or people in a sporting contest, and completely wrong in terms of the context that the kata, what the kata were designed for.
I think just adding to that, Nathan, the sparring is actually a pretty useless mode of practice to go alongside the antique forms, precisely for the reasons you've just explained. And there's the idea of a duel or sparring or a match or anything like that. It's very, very hard to break out of that mindset, I think. And it's even trying to understand, when you're trying to understand the movements in the right context, it's very easy to slip into, well, if somebody does this, then this. If you're in that point, if somebody does this, then this, in terms of looking at an antique form, you've already wandered back into that dueling territory. And I think the intention in the way that the antique forms were to be used in that in the applied function, if you like, is it would be really quick and hopefully over quickly. So you staying with our example of using a pair of sai. I mean, the sai are iron truncheons. That's what they are. It's a pair of truncheons. They're for bashing and hitting with the pommel. If someone's armed with a knife, once you've drawn them, if you haven't been able to bash the knife out of their hands quickly, the risk it goes exponentially up through the roof of being injured. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're blocking and countering, you're in that dueling territory, then it's anyone's fight, and you've stepped outside what the antique forms are showing you, and showing how to navigate the territory, how to go first here, how to stay proactive, how to continue to overwhelm in what's essentially a chaotic environment. And I think that something that has come up a lot is that just because the antique forms have got these brilliant functions, there's no guarantee of the outcome. And I think that's one of the big problems in the modern bunkai, modern application approach to forms, is that there's this kind of assumed outcome. And so that you kind of win and you kind of stop. I don't think that's very helpful at all. And I don't think that's what the antique forms demonstrate. They don't assume the outcome that you're going to win or that it's going to be effective. It's trying to give you some leverage in a very chaotic situation.
Oh, okay. Well, so we've established it's not a duel, and that's critical to understanding the Kata. But there are lots of practitioners. So if we go back to when, so if you go back to the 60s and 70s, there was not a lot of application around of so-called bunkai or interpretation or application, however you want to translate the term. If we go back to the 60s and 70s, there was very little of it. But it grew. One saw it really begin to appear in the early 80s and through the 80s. And there were radical voices out there. Careful of the use of that word, but I'm not talking about religious or political. I'm talking about karate only. But there were radical voices out there, or new thinking, and I know I was involved in that new thinking. That this multiple opponent block strike, best exemplified in Nakayama Sensei's Best Karate series. It was a whole series of books. I forget the publisher. It might have been Kodansha. Demonstrating karate applications to Shotokan Kata. And at that time, Nakayama Sensei was the chief instructor to the Japan Karate Association. And these books tried to lay down some applications to the kata, but they were quite strange in the sense that, the defender would be stood, in his ready position, and the attackers would come at him, 1 to 4 attackers, sometimes more, but usually anywhere from 1 to 4. And the defender would move off on angles resembling the kata and do a block or a double block in to be strange positions and that like the kata, but one had to wonder, why did you do an augmented, a forearm block that's supported against a particular punch, or as opposed to a conventional forearm block with one arm? I remember asking a very prominent sensei that once in the 80s, and his response was that if the attack was particularly strong, you would augment your block. Which made no sense to me at all, because I immediately asked him, how do you know? How can you measure by vision the strength of an attack? And the answer I got back was, well, some of it would be depending on their demeanor and their gait and their physical size. So here we go. So in other words, if the chap's big and mean looking, get ready to use your augmented block. And if he's just an average Joe, you can get away with a conventional middle-level forearm block or whatever it is. Made absolutely no sense to me. But here we were presented with a whole series of books that showed, so you might move off to the right and defend and then counter one opponent. Meanwhile, a bit like the films, really. Meanwhile, the other guys, usually would be there, patiently waiting for they'd be queuing up for. So the next one would then attack you maybe from the left, so you'd turn and do a defensive maneuver and counter him, and then the third one would, and these guys would all sort of go one at a time. Very polite, lovely. So completely not non-realistic. And of course there was the inevitable rebellion against that thinking. So I think this started in the 70s actually. And then during the 80s, there was a complete rebellion, and people started saying, well, no, self-defense is brutal and quick, and it needs to be preemptive. Okay, yeah, I can agree with that. So and people started to do things that weren't in the kata, like headbutting or I remember one instructor who advised spit at them first, spit in the eye, and then headbutt them, and then. And my thinking was, well, what's that got to do, with the kata, with karate? Right? Fortunately for me, I wasn't training with this sensei or under him. I held got the grades to independent of this person giving that advice, but my disquiet with that was that's not anything to do with the kata, and I always said, if that's what we're supposed to do, then the kata should start with a headbutt or a spitting, the spitting action and a headbutt, because you should practice what you need to apply. So we had there was a rebellion from that, and then people decided to separate sparring and self-defense out. So they would do several kinds of karate. They do the kata, they do the sparring, and then they do the fixed drills, in a row. I never really understood why you might practice the same block 50 times in a row. I think that's fine for beginners when they're learning, but once I never understand seeing dan grades, black belts. It's quite often done in a lovely setting, on the beach or the sea or somewhere, or you're under a waterfall, and they do 50 middle level blocks. Why are they blocking against 50 punches? No, it's training. Training for what? What's the context? Why on earth would you ever get so many trained to do so many blocks? It's just accepted. It's that people believe it. It's training. So I'm going to do 50 of these, 2, 3. Well, what for? It's endurance. It's training. It's for beginners. It's not a useful, way of training. And it doesn't really reflect what's in the kata, because if you look at the sanchin or the seisan, the sanseiryu, or the naihanchin, let's go over the fence to the shuri karate or the shorin rib. Those kata are in the order they're in for very good reasons. Just to go back to the point, though, the several types of karate that people start doing as what they consider to be traditional, what they consider to be sparring, and then what they consider to be self-defense. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I know some instructors that have taken that approach, and very good instructors they are, and very, very fine karateka they are, indeed. Those that understand what they're doing, no problem. But unfortunately, there are many out there who don't really understand how it's got like that. And our business here is to explain or describe how it's got like that. It's not really to discredit schools and teachers with that approach. It's just to make it clear that what it is that they are doing and what it is that we are doing, and what value that we understand, what value that could have to other people. So in the 80s, the idea of self-defense kind of really picked up, and so that usually was based on scenario-based training. So, and that would be based on people's perceived ideas of what might have. Someone comes up and grabs you on the collar, so you do this or you do that, or someone comes up and chokes you from behind. Yep, okay, well, you'd have to be quite. I'm not saying you couldn't get caught unawares, but you'd have to be quite unaware to get in some of the positions that So karateka are constantly training timing and distance and gauging the distance between them and themselves and an opponent, and then suddenly, for sake of their exploration of self-defense, they'll passively stand there with an arm out while an assailant comes up and grabs the hand. Why aren't they reacting as normal? How come they're suddenly allowing themselves to be grabbed? And it's because they're justifying their self-defense ideas. It's really simple as that. And a lot of that really increased in the 1980s. And the idea was, well, karate's an art, and so it's just codified into a very dignified, elegant art. which really masks the brutal reality of self-defense. So here's what we really do in a fight. And of course, what's lauded, or what's said to be effective in the fight, of course, as usual, saying the sparring bears virtually no resemblance whatsoever to the kata. But the key trick here is to try and make any self-defense moves that you use, if you're pursuing karate. The trick is to try and make any self-defense moves that you use look like something in the kata, and then it can be seen that you are, and that your applications are really karate and not sort of some street fighting or violence. But in reality, the self-defense, so things like proactive and going first, basically, had a real struggle initially because the founder of Shotokan Karate had built his particular karate on the notion of a term called karate nisenti nashi. Sente is an attack or a hand. Sente is a hand. So there is no first initiative or no first attack. Which left, all the students with, with the view that there must always be first, a block or to receive a force. And that must precede any kind of counter. So a lot of karate was built on this idea, this notion, karate nisenti nashi. There is no initiative, no first hand, no attack, which in itself is actually a lovely concept. If you're looking at a moral way of training, then that's absolutely fine. And we can see that reflected in Funakoshi Jichin Sensei's creation of Tenno Kata. But really, if we're going to talk about policing or guarding or any of the related crafts or policing in general, that's not it. Proactivity is the key to be. You've got to grab the guy quickly. You've got to deal with it. You can't sort of stand off and politely wait for him to start swinging at you. And in fact, once a person gets underway with what I would describe as a compound attack, commonly in karate, you get a step forward and a punch, and then the attacker sort of stops, and there's a block and a counter, and that's fine if you're in the what I call the Tenno Kata zone, when you're in that structured zone for the art of karate do, the way of karate, not karate, I don't know, carelessly karate jutsu, or the technique of karate. If a compound attack is delivered and it gets underway, in other words, the guy is up and swinging, the whole job is made, it's a nightmare. The whole job is made much, much more difficult as you're trying to cope with everything coming in from every direction, when the thing should have been shut down before it even started. And that really is the essence of the antique kata. As Tom said earlier, shut that down before it starts. There's no, it's not a two-way street.
I suppose that goes against the romantic notion of the hero fighting in a duel, that myth created from storytelling and theatre. It's always the bad guy who starts the conflict.
Well, just to add to that, actually, if I may, sorry to jump in there, but it just binged in my mind that that is so ingrained, and it is because everything that, from childhood onwards, everything that we watch, or not everything, but particularly for people interested in combat, and perhaps I might, if I'm allowed to say that in this day and age, for men, it's in the deeply ingrained in the psyche. It's the noonday sun. It's the duel in the sun. It's the pistols, or it's the swords, or it's always that conflict. It's a male fascination and a fear that you have to face the other guy, and it comes in from.
But it's also deeply ingrained in mythology, isn't it? That mythology of the hero.
Well, I think that the idea of the duel is mythologized, but I understand what you mean, but I don't. Let's take a great hero from northern mythology. One of my favorites would be the Thunor, Anglo-Saxon Thor in the Scandinavian. In the accounts in the Thor doesn't really do much in the way of posturing around. He just gets his hammer and goes and bashes the giant, and that's it. There's in cartoons and all the rest of it, you'll have him leaping around because it all gets jumbled up and confused with it always comes back to the sort of the kung fu duel or the karate duel. But I go back to Thor. There's no preamble or posturing or blocking, and he just steps forward and bashes the bad guy with his hammer, and that's the end of it. Which is kind of crudely what the Sai is doing. You're just stepping in and shutting him down, and as Tom says, leaving him pinning and bash with the pommel. That's it. There's no give and take and dodging backwards and ducking and if there is no ducking in the kata. There is none of that. So yeah, I think we're
well. There's no blocking either. There's no blocking in any of the antique forms. So the forms that we worked through, there's no blocks. So there wouldn't be a counter.
That's a difficult one to tell the world.
There's no counters. Well, there's no ground grappling, but there's also no blocks, and there's also no counters, and there's nothing that you would find in a duel or a match or a piece of choreography. I'm not saying that that there aren't forms of choreography for the stage, because there are, but in kung fu systems, and it's been argued elsewhere. But in the antique forms, staying with the ones we've used as an example, so Sanshin, Seisan, and Sanseiryu, yeah, there's no grappling because you're dealing with weapons and potentially dealing with someone with a knife. But there's no blocks, no counters, no choreography. I'm sorry to disappoint.
Tom, you sound like you're talking about kobudo. I thought we were talking about karate.
No, well, yeah. I'll just throw something very, very quick in that kobudo is the kind of runs parallel to karate, particularly in Okinawa. But what you find in the main kobudo schools is long pieces of choreographed dueling, and I would just, from our perspective in Kodo Ryu and the research that Nathan pioneered and we now do as a group, that area of martial arts in Okinawa is nothing to do with the antique kata research that we do. So yes, we're using the iron truncheons, but they're from China, and our approach to the bow and the antique forms connected with that and the tonfa are to do with China and not what was developed in Okinawa along parallel to karate. So as you see the rise of sparring and fixed kumite and kata applications in karate, you also see those same developments take place in Okinawan weaponry, which is, has its own modern course of development as well. Nathan, I don't know if you want to jump on that.
Well, I think we've done it justice. I think we've done that justice, and it's certainly the last place we want to be in any of these practices and applications is on the ground. Why there's no...
If we do find any ground grappling, we will publish it straight away. And if anyone does find an antique form that consists of ground grappling,
let us know.
I'd love to see it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. Today, we've established that ground grappling is fundamentally absent from antique karate kata, not by oversight, but by design. We learned that the core of classical karate kata is about proactive, preemptive action, not a reactive exchange or a dueling match. The forms were never intended for ground fighting, because their purpose was to deal with armed opponents, making the ground the most dangerous place to be. We appreciate you tuning in. For more episodes that challenge traditional martial arts thinking, please subscribe and share with friends. We'll be back next time to debunk another legend.